Okay, so here we have the recorder and going to save the file again in that folder. It's trying. Try it again. Save as. Okay, let's go back to the browser and then start from there. That is strange. Yep, we have the file back and just have to resave it to the folder. Just before this class, we had student presentations, and obviously Murphy's Law hit on every single case. You know, no one could get the computers to work, you know, during a presentation. So I think finally, you know, students are starting to understand, you know, what, you know, instructors have to go through to teach a class. Okay, so this is the program that you have to trace, and it has two invocations on line 6. And we have talked about this, you know, a few times already. It's just that every time I use a different example to illustrate the same thing. So what we'll do is we'll just kind of quickly go through this example, and then we'll move on to the practice exam. There's no practice exam for this class online yet, so I will have to put one, you know, I will basically have to copy one of the practice final exams from another class for this class. But we'll do that, you know, later on. First of all, we focus on the homework assignment. Okay, so we use sheet 2 to trace the program. We need one comments column, one for line number. For the line number, there's not much to say because, you know, there are no global variables. So the precondition, there's nothing. For the precondition, there's nothing to say. Line 9 is the first line to trace because that's the only line that is outside of the definition of a subroutine. And then we will, you know, say, okay, on line 9, what do we want to do? Eventually, we want to print. That's the last operation we have to perform on line 9. But before we can print anything, we have to figure out what the invoke statement is returning. So the first thing is to invoke the subroutine called S2. S2 is a subroutine. It has one parameter. So that means we have to allocate 2 columns because we need 1 column for the return info. So at the end of the subroutine, we know where to continue execution. And then the second column we allocate will be for the parameter n itself, which is passed by value. Anything that is passed by value has its own column of value, which means we use column D in this case to represent the value 2. As far as the return info is concerned, we basically list the line number followed by the rest of the statement that we have to execute when we return from the subroutine. The subroutine invocation itself, invoke S2 goes to n, that portion is replaced by a single question mark as a placeholder for the return value. Okay? In other words, you know, I'm trying to re-explain everything just so that we know why we have the question mark and why we are doing things this way, because, you know, it is important to know why we are doing it in addition to understanding the mechanism of how to do it. Once we set up the columns C and D, we go into the subroutine. When you go into the subroutine, column C and column D, they become the context of execution. In other words, when we go to line 3 and we compare n to 0, that n is now column D, which has a value of 2. So n equals to 0 is false. We go to the else case, we jump to line 6. Line 6 is a return statement. So eventually we want to figure out, you know, what is the value on the right-hand side and then return that value. But I can't do the return just yet because I have to make sure that I can resolve, you know, what is the summation of this invocation, and the 1. So we'll start with the left invocation because we read from left to right. So that means we are taking care of invoke S2, n minus 1 goes to n. That's the first invocation we have to deal with. Just like last time, you have to remember that you need to set up a return info column and also one column for parameter n. Let's deal with parameter n first. Parameter n is specified by the argument n minus 1. The argument n minus 1 is using the n in the context of column D. So that means we are using 2 minus 1 or 1 to pass to the new parameter n. As a result, column F ends up with a value of 1. Is that okay so far? Okay. The return info is going to be line 6 itself. It tells me what else I have to do by the time I get back from this new invocation of S2. To make it, all fit on the screen, I have to turn on line wrapping because otherwise, there's no way I can display, enough columns to deal with this trace. So I would say this is line 6. When we're done, we go back to line 6. Line 6 still has the return to be done. The invocation I'm taking care of right now is replaced by a single value, but I have to add to the return value of the other invocation of S2. And then on top of that, I also have to add a constant of 1 at the very end. So that's why we have return info being this rather long statement, because it tells me by the time I get back to line 6, we still have a few more things to do on line 6. Are we doing okay about regarding how we have to set up return info? Okay. Once we set up column E and column F, we can go into the subroutine again, starting on line 3. When we go to line 3 at the beginning of the subroutine, column E and column F become my context. So that means when I compare n to 0, I am using column F this time. 1 equals to 0 is false. I go to line 6 again. So basically, we are setting up things the same way, with one exception. N is no longer the same as last time because we are now dealing with 1 minus 1, which is 0. So this one is actually a 0 this time and not a 1. Are we doing okay? Because I'm trying to save some time for the practice final. So that's why I just copy and paste whenever I can. Okay. So now, with column G and column H set up, I can go back and start the execution from the beginning of the subroutine on line 3. And this time refers to column H, which does have a value of 0, so the condition is true. We move on to line 4. Line 4 is returning a value of 2. There are 3 things you have to do when you execute a return statement, when you're ready to return a value. The first thing is to go to the rightmost return info cell. In this case, it is column G. And then the second thing is to copy and paste it. And then the third thing is to replace the question mark with the value that you're returning. In this case, we are returning a constant of 2, and that's why I'm just replacing the question mark with a constant of 2. And that's it. Do not do any more than what I have just described when you execute a return statement. I know this shows you that we still have one more invocation to deal with, but this is not the time to deal with the right invocation. Okay? After line 4, we get out of the conditional statement. We end up on line 8. Line 8 is the end of the entire subroutine, which means we have to deallocate all the columns that we allocated for this invocation. And then what do? We go back to line 6. Very good. We go back to line 6 because return info tells me to go back to line 6. But line 6 does not look like the line 6 in the pseudocode anymore. Line 6 now looks like this. It is partially resolved. In other words, I'm trying to execute line 6 as described by G12. The cell G12 is telling me what is on line 6 at this point. I can't do the return just yet because I have one more invocation to deal with. Now, even though this invocation has exactly the same parameter as the previous one, you cannot assume that it returns exactly the same value. So what we have to do is to invoke it again. In other words, we are now taking care of the right invocation of S2. Well, invoking S2 involves pretty much the same thing as last time. We have to allocate one column for return value or return info and one for the parameter n. Parameter n is 0 this time because when you execute the right-hand side, when we refer to n minus 1, that n is using the context of f. We are actually back to column E and column F at this point. So that's why we are using 1 minus 1, which is 0, to be our new parameter n. Return info is based on line 6. The first part is resolved, so we keep whatever we had already resolved. The second part, or the right invocation, is the one that we are taking care of at this point, and as a result, it is replaced by a single question mark. And don't forget the +1 at the very end, because we do have that 1 + 1 in the original code. Once we set up column G and column H, we can go into the subroutine, starting on line 3. And n equals to 0 is true. We go to line 4, same as last time. We copy and paste the return info cell, change the question mark to whatever value we are returning, which is 2 in this case. And then we get out of the conditional statement. We go to line 8, the end of the subroutine. We deallocate all the columns, just like last time. And then we continue execution on line 6 again, because that's what return info is telling me, is to continue execution on line 6. Except this time, line 6 looks like this. I'm trying to execute the statement described by G17 at this point. The statement in G17 has no additional invocations left. I do have to perform the additions, but that's okay because 2 + 2 is 4, 4 + 1 is 5. I know exactly what value I'm supposed to return this time. That means I can actually go ahead and execute the return statement itself at this point. Okay, so in order to execute the return statement, I have to first find out, okay, what is the return info cell that I'm going to act on this time? It is column E. So what we need to do is to copy and paste column E over here, change the question mark to a value of 4, and then we are done. Oh, is it 5? Sorry. So we change the value to 5 because the 5 is the return value, and we are done with the return statement. I know there's a right invocation that is not done yet, but this is not the right time to do it. Okay. After line 6, we go to line 8, which is the end of the subroutine. We deallocate the columns that were allocated for this invocation, and then we return to line 6. Okay. In other words, there are two mechanisms that are similar in some ways, and that's the source of confusion. One is the return statement. What do we do when we execute a return statement? The second one is what do we do at the end of a subroutine? Okay, those are the two things that can cause confusion. In this case, we are at the end of a subroutine. We deallocate the columns, and then we continue execution based on the return info cell that is now partially resolved. But it is not fully resolved because we are trying to execute the statement in E19 at this point, and it still has one invocation left, which means we have to now invoke S2 again because it is the right invocation, the right-hand side. So that means we have to switch back here because column C and column D are my current context. So when I try to set up parameter n, it is now back to 1 because 2 minus 1 is 1. Are we doing okay with column F? Okay. When you specify the return info cell, you basically copy everything on that line except for the invocation itself, which is replaced by a question mark. Okay. And now we have to go back into the subroutine starting on line 3 and then ask the question again. So this part should be boring at this point because this is something that we have done again. This is something that we have done already and we are just doing it again.